Well, I think that maybe we can get started and folks will trickle in. So thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Andrea Casalonis. I am the Adult Services Librarian at Falmouth Memorial Library, and we are so excited to once again be partnering with the Camden Conference to bring you this event. I'd like to pass it over to Pamela Berry, who is with the Camden Conference, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about that.
Hi, my name is Pam Barry, and on behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for being present tonight. And I'd like very much to thank Andrea and the Falmouth Library for all the hard work they do. The Camden Conference will be celebrating its 35th annual conference in February 25th and 6th. The title of the conference is Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad. Information on the tickets to the conference is available at the Camden Conference website, which is camdenconference.org. You'll find more information about the conference as well as lists of the presenters. It is a fabulous list and it's an international list, so it really makes a big difference that way. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discussion across a number of groups. And it's very important that we have community input. I think the libraries are to be commended and recommended for the amount of work they do in presenting conference events that go on all year, and that it's an opportunity for people to do questions and answers. Again, I would encourage you to go to the camdenconference.org, find out more about the conference and how you can attend. And I would like again to welcome you tonight, and I'll go back to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Go ahead and switch over here. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to be discussing climate change in contemporary Europe, and with us tonight is Dr. Susannah Hancock. I'm sure you've all seen a little bit of her bio in our program description, but I want to reiterate some things because she's a pretty remarkable individual. Susannah decided she would be an astrophysicist at age 4, and just 10 years later, she was an astrophysics student at USM. And that's when she began to wonder how her extraterrestrial passions could improve Earth's environment. So she has 3 degrees from the University of Oxford and is now a multidisciplinary Arctic climate researcher and has lived throughout the European Arctic. She's been an invited speaker at international TED events, UN conferences, and other global events. She routinely contributes to policy papers, articles, and book chapters on a variety of subjects related to Arctic climate. So she's currently based in Maine, where she is on the executive committee for Democracy League, the steering committee for Citizens Climate Lobby, the Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and the RSU 5 board, as well as Freeport Sustainability Advisory Board, and on several Camden Conference committees. So she has a very diverse background, and she is an extremely knowledgeable individual who I'm going to turn the floor over to now. So thank you so much, Susannah, for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Lovely to be here and join with everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Actually, I can do it straight this way. No, that's not what I wanted to do. I thought I had this all lined up, perfectly ready to go. One more try. Advanced part of my screen. There we go. Okay, we will try that. For some reason it doesn't want to actually just run the slideshow tonight. So thank you so much for being here. I'm happy as we go through this. I'll talk for about an hour. Happy to take questions throughout. Probably have to do a song and dance to catch my attention because when I'm sharing the screen, I don't always see the chat, but happy to, if anybody does have a question, raise your hand. And Andrea, if you see any hands and you want to interrupt me, go for it, or something that comes up on the chat, please be my eyes there, and happy to take those, happy to take anything afterward discussions. So yeah, so just a little bit of an overview of what I'll talk about. Just a little bit about Europe climate issues, some of the current legislation, talk a little bit about 2021 current fuel issues, because that's a topic that's a little bit personal in some ways, but has come up. Climate refugeeism, which has been a main topic in Europe in the past decade especially. And then just a little bit about oceans, partly because I'm interested in oceans, but also because there's some interesting areas in which climate policy has really affected other areas of European policy and tested different perspectives, and also brought together people who really disagree. So with that, get started. So these are two maps of Europe, and they look fairly similar. You don't need to pay much attention to the legend on the right, but what just want to see is just the gradual move north of the darker reds and the darker blues moving north. So looking specifically, if we look over in the Spain, Portugal, Iberian Peninsula area, just see some of those shifts and patterns. And here, France, so you can see how that brown color is moving in a bit up in that Denmark, Germany region, and then up in northern Finlandia. So these are just getting, small changes, but these changes, the first picture is 75 to 95, and the next one's 1996 to 2016. So 20-year increments. But we can see over this total 40-year span that things are shifting. And so this is, what's living there, the forest structure, etc. So it's an area that, again, while we're not necessarily thinking of the hotspot for climate, changes are definitely underway. So this is another map of Europe, just highlighting some of the different environmental issues that affect different parts of Europe. So the red area, you see decreased water availability, increased drought, heat, erosion, reduction in crops, etc. In the yellow, greater flood risk, hotter, drier summers. I don't know if any of you remember, in 2013 especially, but more recently as well, there were high heat spells in France and England. Sea level rise and crop issues. So with more rain, with the floods, getting some of those pests that get in disease in the crops. Then in the blue, decreased rainfall in the summer, but increased storms in the winter. So you're seeing more of a seasonal draw. Here you're getting some of the benefits, so to speak. You're getting a longer growing season, more farmland, etc. In the green, also getting more farming potential there. More rainfall in the winter. Again, this sort of seasonal juxtaposition. Wetter winters, drier summers. So one of the big things I think on recent mind when we're talking about European politics, at least in my circles, maybe this is less so as we're now about 2 months away from it, but was the COP26 conference in Glasgow that took place the first 2 weeks of November. And this conference was hosted by the UK. Italy was a co-host for it as well. But it was run by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so this is an international organization that's been hosting these conferences since 1994. And generally they travel around the world. There's supposedly, there's a little map or a rotation, a rota that they travel. So this coming year, it's in Egypt, the following year in Abu Dhabi. Last year, 2019, there wasn't one last year. It was supposed to be in Chile, and it ended up, for political reasons, being in Madrid. So it's supposed to move around, but it often defaults to Europe, partly because the UN climate network is based in Bonn, Germany. So that becomes, when there's an issue, bring it back to Europe. But that said, Europe is also a big leader in climate negotiations, not just because the rest of the UN is based in Europe, and there's many factors of the UN that are either directly related to climate or are dealing with issues that are sort of secondary issues associated with climate. But the EU at this conference held more than 150 side events that were focused on climate within the EU, and those attracted people. 220,000 people attended those events, both in person and online, and those were both in Glasgow at the conference, but also in Brussels at the EU base. And so in another 2 weeks or so, I guess I'm speaking a little bit about that process specifically, in the quote process, and how that works with European politics. So I won't get into that too much here, but if there are questions about it, happy to talk a bit more about that. That said, at this conference, while there were a lot of, in my opinion, shortcomings and missed opportunities, there were some areas that Europe really took that strong lead. One of them was that EU, along with the US, really spearheaded the global methane pledge, which is, the critic in me says it's a little bit too late. It addresses maybe 40% of the methane that we need to eradicate from the atmosphere if it meets its full goals. But on the other hand, it's the first time that people have taken seriously any greenhouse gas that has not been CO2 in terms of policy at this level. So another goal that came out of this conference that was directed from the EU was that of climate finance. And this is sort of a redo of a failed policy. In 2009, this conference was held in Copenhagen, and there was a climate finance agreement that came out in which developed countries would put forth a certain amount of money to help other countries that need support in climate adaptations. And that money never really materialized beyond initial commitments. So this was a take again. Let's help those who are more vulnerable and need some assistance. And so the EU is the largest contributor, would be also the largest contributor, funds approximately 1/3 of this global fund. And Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, announced that she would be pledging, or the EU would be upping its pledge to about 28 billion euros a year, assuming full follow through. So we're looking at approximately $100 billion a year that we want to be getting in this fund. So these are just some posters from Glasgow. I like posters. I like creativity. I like it when they're, in Glaswegian English. It's kind of fun. So, but just for a little bit of legislative policy in Europe. So I guess, yeah, that was one area. Another area was sort of looking at some issues in climate policy in Europe. One of the big systems they've done is their ETS system, which ETS is emission trading scheme. And the idea is very much of a cap and trade, sort of a carbon pricing in some capacities. And we certainly have bills right now in the House and the Senate that are looking at something very similar to this. And Maine is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the RGGI initiative, that again is a trade system. So this system began in 2005, and its idea was to reduce emissions from factories and institutions that have there were about 11,000 institutions throughout the EU that qualified for this. And they have to have a net heat excess of 20 megawatts. And so that's, as said, yeah, in the EU, but also Liechtenstein, Norway, Iceland, and the United Kingdom are also privy to this. It's so far in the past, since it started to 2020, I guess, has reduced emissions by about 3.8%. So it's fairly small, but it's sort of a system. It was a start, and it was a, where can we go from here? And this is one of the systems that's applying pressure on the US because they're talking about border adjustments. I don't know if you're familiar with those discussions in the news. Canada is also talking about carbon border adjustments with US trading. So we may be going in this route as well. This system was put in different phases. The first phase, which started in 2005, very much of a test phase. It works by having, a certain amount of allowances and a certain amount of pollution. And if I want to pollute X numbers of tons of carbon dioxide, I need to be able to purchase allowances to do so. And the idea is that the allowances are reduced in quantity, they become more expensive, it costs me more to pollute, therefore I want to innovate into some other sphere. So that's really how it worked. But when they started it, it cost about 10 cents a ton of carbon dioxide, which is negligible and not even noticeable for companies of this caliber. So it's definitely been sort of a trial and error. And they have, with the EU and European Economic Agreement in 2012, they started trying to do this with airplanes, but then only planes that flew over a country that was associated with, that had signed on to this, those emissions would count. So you're looking at a plane from Britain to Switzerland, and half of their route wouldn't actually count. So it's how do you calculate those emissions? So it got all a little bit chaotic. But as of last summer, well, as of now, I guess, a ton of carbon dioxide has gone up to 57 euros. So quite a bit more than 10 cents of 13 years ago. And they're hoping that within this decade, it's really going to reduce emissions maybe up to 60% of where they were in 2005. So big hopes for it. But as I said, so far we're looking at less than 4% of a reduction historically. So we'll see. But that's really forming the base of a lot of European policy right now. It is a system that's vulnerable to cyber attacks, and said, hasn't really been prosperous enough to trigger the innovation that they were hoping for. We do see countries like Sweden where they have a tax that's about double or a bit over double this. So, there are places coming forth, but also ties into countries in Europe and where they're getting their fuel sources. And this map, I will say, is by British Petroleum put it out. So just a notice on the source. I'm not going to take anything here totally accurately. I know Germany's just changed its ruling on nuclear and various things, and this is a couple of years old, this map. But what I want to see here is just the variety of where fuel is coming from, where different countries are heavy. So Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, much heavier on the petroleum, the fossil fuels, the coal, the oil, the natural gas. That's making up 80%, 90% of the Netherlands fuel. And you can look and compare that to, Norway, where you're down at maybe 25%. And Norway's, you get into sort of the politics of how you define that, because they obviously are a huge oil exporter, but they export a lot of that. So what do they actually have to count for themselves? So, but the idea is that, there's a lot of different sources that people have coming from. And so there is, hold on. So in this map here, Europe in the middle with the lighter colors, this just shows the wealth of existing oil, petroleum wealth of that country in the sense of personal reserves. So you can see Russia, for example, very dark colored. Russia has a lot of petroleum. So what's to notice here is that Europe doesn't really have a lot of its own resources. We can take Norway out of the equation because they're not EU. Oil is a big reason why they're not part of the EU. But looking at continental Central Europe, they're reliant on other countries for petroleum. Russia has been a supplier, as has the surrounding region. There is right now what they're calling an oil crisis in Europe. And that was because there was a big push to get away from fossil fuels. without the simultaneous development or strong enough development of non-fossil fuels. And this meant that Russia, for example, instead of trading with Europe, it just started focusing more on its domestic output and input. Algeria, the country south of Spain, that's dark, stopped trading with Spain. The United States was another trader with Europe, and it decided it was more prosperous for it to be trading with Asia, and it was getting more money sending its petroleum to Asia, and so bypassing Europe. So Europe kind of has found itself in a bit of this vacuum. And I got a little bit face-to-face, a little bit too face-to-face with a Russian leader a couple months, 2 months ago or so, when I was at the UN, and I was talking about how we're talking about petroleum and this sort of issue. And he came right up to me and he was sort of like, well, in absence of not a better solution, don't you think that petroleum is what we need, because otherwise we're going to be cold in this winter? And there's still this, so it came into this, you know, right here, but it came into the sort of, you know, petroleum is what we need in the here and the now. And Europe has this vision for the future, and it gets into these debates about how does it take care of that? How can it have the sort of innovation it wants without necessarily all the investments that it needs to have in those? But that said, you know, the EU Green Deal that is part of this that came out a little while ago, you know, it's going over legislation, circular economy, biodiversity, building renovation, innovation. Those are all being examined to figure out how can we get Europe with what Europe has called sort of its man on the moon moment, its opportunity to lead the world in a cleaner future. This does create issues when we're looking at the EU itself, because there are countries in the EU, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, for example, have all spoken out saying that they really feel it's not fair for the EU to say that the EU at large needs to reduce its emissions. It's talking 50% by the end of this decade, hopefully a bit more than 50%. And how is it fair to ask that of all countries when you have countries that are in very different economic situations? The EU does have finance, or some financial support for this project. But the idea from these countries is those who probably can most benefit from the finance or benefit from this Green Deal are the same countries that probably could have been making this innovation already, and yet taking advantage of loopholes because other countries haven't been doing the innovation. So lots of questions about that. And, you know, you get issues with ExxonMobil, for example, being one of the architects for this plan. So they later came out and said that they designed it in a way that would not impact their business, their petroleum industry, as much as other petroleum industries. So lots of discussions about who's really benefiting, who's really behind all of these. But you know, the criticism, the loopholes, the countries like Romania and Czech Republic that have said that if this is where the EU is going to go, they can't remain part of the EU. And I don't know that they've ever really gotten this close, sort of a Brexit moment, but they have said that this could be something that would push them in that direction. But, you know, it's ultimately sort of that too little, too late. And this just shows, going back a moment, this is just the pipelines going through Europe, and not really important to read them at all or even to pay attention to the different colors, but it's just sort of showing around Europe. The red and orange lines are natural gas shipping routes. Well, green are the existing pipelines. So yeah, so the big deal is, you know, getting Europe, they're sort of their man on the moon moment, wanting to be that first carbon free. But again, we're talking, you know, carbon, when they're talking carbon free, it's that net zero, which I had the sign a moment ago here about, no net zero, and I don't know how many people are familiar with the concept of net zero and why it's a little bit problematic, but the idea is that you pollute, but you extract the same amount of pollution that you're putting into the atmosphere. The big problem with that is that we are talking scale. We put out last year 31 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The largest system in the world to extract carbon from the atmosphere was built last year, and it can take away 4,000 tons. 4,000 tons is the equivalent of about 790 cars. So that's my town. And, we're looking at the whole world. And to be able to say that we can continue to pollute at 31 billion tons a year, we're wiping my town off the map pollution wise, that's not getting us to zero. So we're talking, when we hear these sort of net zero by 2050, it's, putting, in many ways, putting this problem off. We will have a solution. Trust us, we'll have a solution. And so that's where it gets a little bit antsy. That all said, you can see that climate is pretty much the top concern of Europeans. And this is Pew Research Center. This is 2018, so it's pre-pandemic. But we can see that global climate change tops concerns of respondents across 10 different European countries. So if we look during the pandemic, this is spring of 2020, so the pandemic has started. Global climate change still is the top of the list, right ahead of infectious disease. And moreover, we can note, so also just by way of clarity, this second map is European countries, but it also includes Australia, South Korea, the US and Canada, and Japan. So it is a little bit, it's not quite the apples to apples comparison, but it is still as European countries. So still have global climate change at the top, infectious diseases, terrorism, cyber attacks from other countries, nuclear. I have a slight question on that one for a moment, but global economy, poverty, and ethnic conflict and migration. What's interesting with all of these is that these 8 topics here, the secondary concerns, can all be seen as related to global climate change. And so in that, for example, I have the European migrant crisis or the European refugee crisis, which is certainly one of those issues that instigated or triggered a lot of Brexit, and Britain's unhappiness in the EU wasn't at all exclusively about migration, but having lived in England at this time, a lot of the people who voted to leave were focusing on things like migration. So this crisis is referred to the past decade in which people have come to Europe at significantly higher rates. This is especially true in 2015, when 1.3 million people came into Europe, which is the highest number since the Second World War. So lots of people, lots of reasons that people were coming into Europe in such droves: political instability, lack of food and water, conflict, but climate instability is certainly a catalyst for each of these. I was just, on a personal note, I was racing in a rowing regatta in France, and I was driving from England, well, I was driving through France, I guess, parked on the border of France and England for the night, and got up in the morning, started driving the trailer, got about an hour or so down the road, and there was a massive ruckus in the back. Pulled over, turned out that there were people who had been hiding out in our trailer for the night, thinking that they'd be able to get to England that way. And when they realized that we were not going, or that we were going away from England, they needed to get out. And so this is just people just trying to get in any way they can. And what's quite interesting, I guess, from the climate migration aspect, something I find interesting anyway, is just our term of climate migration. It used to be a term people would use to describe going somewhere attractive. So, you can see, for example, people who live in Maine, but they go to Florida for the winter because they like the temperatures there. It's better. So it's that type of pattern. Where would I go to somewhere that I like? Where do I want to be? What would be attractive for me? And now when we talk about climate migration around the world, we're talking about escaping from this place. I'm no longer safe. I can't live here. So it's sort of this interesting comparison that we've gone away from what would be nice to get me out. And said, especially in 2015 in that year, a lot of that was coming from, a lot of those migrants were coming from places like Syria. And Syria, if you wanted to take a climate look at it, you're saying that there was mass urbanization. And why was there mass urbanization? In part because people who were farmers were not able to farm. There was massive drought, 900-something year drought. People were really just got to the point where farming wasn't possible. They were not able to support their families. So they have to move to the cities, and the government was not strong enough to be able to really move forward and take that influx. So civil conflict exploded. And how things like climate fit within emergency responses, both, there where the government didn't really know how to react. And, in the US, where global sea level rise in this country, even to the point where in certain places it's swallowing communities, is not a federally declarable disaster. It's considered a slow moving event, and it's considered something that is largely preventable or avoidable. So we can have certainly disasters from climate related events, storms, etc. But I've been working with a community in Northern Alaska that lost 126 feet of its shoreline one day in a storm a couple of years ago, and lost a handful of houses. And feds were saying, well, that's climate change. That's something you can predict. So, within the US and our FEMA structure, there's a lot of, so, I don't want to focus on that, but just saying that this is sort of a universal issue. And certainly with the Taliban last summer, seeing how people who, again, used to farm were joining the Taliban because the Taliban was a promise of an income. You can't feed your family farming if you're not able to farm, but join the Taliban and we will provide for you. So lots of those sort of areas in which climate in Europe is tied into political instability and other issues. So just go into one example that I also kind of like, because if you know anything about me, you know that I like Scandinavia and I like Iceland. So this is an example that, sort of like those conflicts before, show where climate can be a catalyst for conflict, or low simmering issues when you add in the environment can become more escalated, can escalate. So the Cod Wars is a collective term for a series of mainly 20th century confrontations between the United Kingdom and West Germany and Iceland about fishing rights in the North Atlantic. Notably, each one with an Icelandic victory. None of these so-called wars meet any threshold to be described as a war. It was simply termed by a journalist in 1958. But they were militarized disputes. One person died, and that was not actually directly caused by any fighting. It was in a boat repair. So European fishing vessels were sailing to Iceland waters in search of fish as early as the 800s. Fish was a staple in English fishing vessels. Fish was a staple in the English diet. possibly relating to exchanges between England and other Scandinavian people before. So the Kingdom of Denmark, the Danish king, who was at the time in control of Iceland, began to be concerned about overfishing. So we can see that, you know, overfishing is something that is not a present day thought. It was going back 1,000 years. And so the King of Denmark banned all British ships from fishing in Iceland. And England then under Henry V accepted, but then didn't really tell anybody, didn't do any kind of enforcing for this. So fishing continued. And this contributed to the Anglo-Asiatic War in 1469 to 1474. And so Britain in 1474 was able to negotiate, partially was negotiating the Treaty of Utrecht, which did reopen some of these fishing areas in Iceland. And Britain returned full steam to Iceland. Full steam literally in the 19th century when steam power came out and England was able to get to Iceland a lot faster and do a lot more fishing. And the Danish government again became a lot more concerned about overfishing and put out a unilateral claim to Icelandic waters 50 nautical miles off the coast, in which it said Britain cannot fish. Britain did, and so Iceland responded with arrests and fines, and Britain responded by sending over the British Navy. There was an agreement that was brokered out of this that basically said, well, Iceland can keep 3 nautical miles to its shore, and otherwise Britain can come. And so things that started at the turn of the 20th century, things calmed down again with the First World War. And in the interwar period, things escalated a little bit. But the first real sort of Cod War, so to speak, started in 1958 to 1961, when Iceland, again, concerned with the overfishing, said 3 nautical miles for its exclusive economic zone isn't much, it's going to take 12. So this unilateral movement was opposed by all NATO countries, of which the UK and Iceland are both part. And again, the Brits responded by bringing in the Navy. So British Navy had 53 Navy vessels. Iceland had its grand total of 7 patrol boats, one of which was capable of interfering with any kind of British ship, whether Navy or fishing vessel. And they also had 1 amphibious airplane. So massively outpowered there on the Union Jack front. But Iceland won. And the Second War was 1972 to 1973. Iceland again said, 12 nautical miles is nice, but 50 would be better. So they extended their economic zone to 50 nautical miles, again leading to conflict. Iceland, knowing that it can't fight Britain's Navy, instead started cutting nets. This was sidetracked a bit when a volcano down here off the southern coast of Iceland erupted in January 1973. And it's a fishing village there. People who live there, about 5,000 people, I believe, who were living there at the time. And all fishing vessels went to help with this community and help sort of pour water on the volcano and rescue all the inhabitants. For anecdotal reference, for what it's worth, I've been there a few times, but this volcano is still smoking, and you can still cook your fish on the top of it. So it's kind of fun. It's still pretty hot. So this sort of sidetracked. So when the fighting couldn't really take place between boats on the water, it took place on shore, and citizens, Icelanders, attacked the British embassy and vandalized it. And the Brits who were in Reykjavik did likewise. So that sort of took short, but they returned to disputing on the water 1975 to 1976. Again, when Iceland had achieved its 50 nautical miles and tried to go for that 200 nautical miles. Nets were cut, boats were rammed. And one of the issues with this, though, is that it got into, let's see, is that it gets into a bit of Cold War politics. And that's what I find quite interesting, is seeing that nexus of environmental policy and geopolitics in the world. And that's because of Iceland's strategic position. And that's really what enabled Iceland to have this power, and why Iceland was able to win and to keep its fish, really. When Iceland was fighting these debates with the UK, it couldn't use the UK as a trading partner for fish. And there were other countries that maybe allied with the UK, and so it impacted Iceland's trade. Iceland's not part of the EU. This was pre-EU, but Iceland was in a bit of a different trading sphere. So it started trading with Russia. And so NATO countries were a little bit concerned about Iceland's relations with Russia. But Iceland also sits at what's known as the GI-UK gap, which is the Greenland, Iceland, UK. If we look in the northern part of this map, we have the northern sea route here, but this is the northern fleet from Russia. If they want to get to Europe, they are going past Iceland or through the UK, but the channel is quite narrow. So being able to control Iceland from a NATO perspective is really quite powerful. And so it was NATO that was able to really come in and help Iceland. If any of you have flown to Iceland, if you've flown from the United States, you've landed in Keflavik, and that is a former US airbase, naval station. And so that was sort of the head of all of these operations. So when Iceland is fighting for its cod, it basically just needed to threaten to withdraw from NATO, and NATO would lose this power lose its airbase in Keflavik, and lose this sort of control over the Soviet Union. So much like the air and pollutions, waters are also part of the shared economic agreement within Europe. And so we have this, what came out of Iceland, their last request to NATO was that 200 nautical miles, and that has become codified in the UN Convention Law of the Seas. And so this map, you can see that Britain's been removed from it, which makes areas a little bit more tight, but the darker blue highlights areas, European free trade waters, in which that's 200 nautical miles off of the coast, but obviously coming in to meet other territories. And the idea here is that the EU has open trade. It's the largest, I believe it's the largest common fisheries area in the world. 88,000 registered fishing vessels from the EU that fish in these waters, and they catch they catch a known amount of 600 million metric tons of fish annually. It's obviously very hard to enforce this, and there's estimates that maybe this number is actually about twice what is the actual catch. Landing value is about twice of what is being reported. So much like that ETS, that emissions scheme I mentioned earlier, we're looking at sort of a global quota, and it's vulnerable to. It has oversight, but vulnerable to misuse and loopholes, such as landings not being reported, but also countries that feel that they have more of a right than somebody else to fish in their area. So, or that maybe they feel that there happen to be more fish in one area than another, so they can fish more in that region. And it's just a lot of little oversight where things definitely go. One though that I think again ties this sort of this environmental aspect to greater politics. If you look at the Faroe Islands, which is this part here, the green in the middle, and the Faroe Islands, part of Denmark, but they're not part of the EU. And they're fishing, as one might expect, being stuck in the middle of the North Atlantic, heavily fishing economy, community there. But they're not part of the EU, so they're not part of the trade. They're not, the EU isn't overseeing their catch, but also not helping them with trade partners. So the Faroes, unlike Denmark, had to find its own trading partners, and it found a big one with Russia. And it relied extensively, still does, relies extensively with trade with Russia. And that was fine until 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, and the EU together launched a response of sanctioning Russia over Crimea. And they requested the Faroes stop trading with Russia over this. And Faroes, we can do that, but we don't have any other trading partners. And so and they really didn't in that capacity. Europe, the EU wasn't wanting to say, well, trade with us. It was, well, that's not really our problem. So the Faroes continued to trade with Russia, but it became this challenging time where whose resources belong to whom, how do they get really divided, who really has which allocations. So
Susannah, Andrea here. I just wanted to hop in because we do have a question that came in.
yes,
So
I could read that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, are you able to see the Q&A, or would you like me?
I am able to see
Okay,
it.
perfect.
Okay, let's see, Kim. I hope we can all agree that climate change is our greatest threat, and all subordinate threats are rooted therein. But when we're immersed in the daily political fueled news feed, where hot issues rise to the surface, like climate, migrants, flooding borders, and getting energy to Europe. Yeah. I think that was sort of very much, Kim, I only read part of that out loud. I don't know if everybody else or if people can see it, if I have it right there on my screen. Yeah, that's sort of a hot topic, hot button issue with that. And I think that's what, when I was saying I had this Russian leader come right to my face. And I mean, that was a lot of what his point was. And how do we get the energy to Europe, especially if Europe has not only having issues getting it from places like Russia and the US and Africa, but when it's also trying to innovate itself without all of the necessary innovation. How does one remain optimistic? Talking with people and trying to really understand what's driving different motivations and different views, I think really helps me anyways, just having those conversations and understanding where policy is coming from and what it's rooted in, and looking at things such as, climate from, as you say, from the public view, taking a back seat. What are sort of some of the underlying causes of some of these issues, and how can we, if we're going to address some of these issues, because you can't, if you're going to address a migrant crisis or an energy crisis, you're not just going to address, you have to sort of take a holistic approach, and I think that holistic approach often gets lost in the discussions. But I don't know if I've answered your question sufficiently, but we can talk more about it if not. So I'll just give one more example that I kind of like, because it shows an area of where these debates come head to head. So this is of deep sea mining, and again, staying with the ocean for a little bit, but again, seeing things come diametrically opposed to each other. So deep sea mining is a new practice. It's not yet commercially done, in which one extracts minerals from the ocean floor. The idea is that it collects these deposits of minerals either through hydraulic pumps, so very much like a vacuum just going along the ocean floor, or a bucket system like Kit at the sand beach, picking up a bucket of sand, see what you got in it, put it maybe through a strainer, dump the rest of it out. Pretty simple technology. The biggest one in the world is right in the middle of the screen to the right, the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the middle of the Pacific. Lots of challenges getting there. It's quite deep and big. There are several in the northern parts of Europe, right there. And these are a bit more accessible, closer to land, a little bit shallower in the water. And what we're looking for here is really at those plate edges, looking for those extinct hydrothermal vents. And these vents create these sulfide deposits, which then house these precious metals such as silver and cobalt, manganese, zinc, gold, copper, etc. All of these are needed for our green technology. So the EU has put a moratorium on deep sea mining because it says it believes it's environmentally disastrous, which I think it is. But it's and also the fact that we don't really know much about it. But what we do know isn't good for the environment. Pollution in the water column, corrosion, leakage of these machines, blocking sunlight for the zooplankton, changes in pH, filter feeders that live on the bottom of the ocean. We can clog their take in. You can imagine a vacuum cleaner going along the ocean floor. It kind of chews up whatever it comes to. So not a good system when you look at it environmentally. Companies like Samsung and Google and BMW, all of whom really rely on this green technology and need these minerals, have said that this is not a practice that they can actively support. Norway, on the other hand, which is not part of the EU, has said that actually this looks pretty good because it beats the on-land alternative. Norway is a heavily mining country. It mines not just in other countries, but it mines in its own area, and it is constantly into issues of justice and climate, environmental justice and social issues. Where is that mining? Who is impacted? How is it impacting the communities, et cetera? So it says, if you move this to the ocean, we don't have to deal with the people. Sounds like a good deal. And they reckon also that it's about 30% more environmentally friendly than what they were doing on land. Of course, you can say to some degree what you do on land kind of stays on land. You mine your part of the country. The rest of the world doesn't necessarily need to know about it. Whereas if you're mining into the ocean, those borders, nothing stays in your national borders. So, the EU is saying, yes, you're deep sea mining, but it's kind of our waters. It's everywhere. It's not contained. But the fact that Norway is saying that this is actually a cleaner, more environmental practice, safer practice than it would be if they were doing it on land. And so I just find this kind of an interesting example because it's looking at two countries or two regions, the EU and Norway, that have a very similar goal in mind. And that is, we need this green technology because this is what's going to give us those solar panels. This is what is going to give us those electric vehicles, that electrification without the reliance on fossil fuels. But how can we get it? And how can we get it in as a way that's environmentally, I don't know, responsible, but as safely as possible, and having, what is more important? Is it the overall reduction in emissions, or is it the fact that we're damaging this ecosystem? And how does that all balance out? So this is something that's very much of a current debate. And as I said, it's not a practice that is in any kind of official commercial production yet, but they are doing it, and it's lots of support to get it there in the coming years. So I think I will leave it there, just about at the top of the hour. And if anybody has any further questions, or I'm happy to take any, otherwise happy to send you on your evenings. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Susannah, for that presentation. Very informative, very timely information. So if anybody wants to chime in with a question, you can put it in the Q&A, the chat, or raise hand. If you don't have the chance to ask your question tonight, I will be sending a follow-up email to all registrants, and I'd be happy to take questions via email as well and get them to Susannah.
And I'm also, very happy to email responses or have conversations later as well.
Well, excellent. So I think let's leave it at that if nobody has any questions. And thank you again. Thank you to our attendees. And Kimberly chimed in and said thank you as well. So I'm glad everybody learned a lot. And we'll see you at our next Camden conference event. The library will be hosting an event on the 15th of February at 6 p.m. on the effects of Brexit on the EU. So please reach out if you have any interest in that. And again, please reach out if you have any questions about the information presented this evening. Thank you, Susannah. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.